Hello, everybody. We are very, very excited today. Francesca and I are very happy because we have the opportunity to interview somebody that has influenced our clinical practice to a very, very large extent. We have the opportunity to interview Michael Perelman. So most of you will probably already know that Michael Perelman made a very important contribution in our field because he actually conceptualized a model, the sexual tipping point model, that actually is a very, very useful tool in our clinical practice. So Michael Perelman has been working in the field for many years. He started his PhD at Columbia in the field of sex therapy in 1976. In those days, with Helen Kaplan together. So he has a lot of stories to tell us and a lot of important information to share with us.
Thanks.
So Michael, it's so great that we have you here and that we can ask you a few things because you have such long experience. So the first thing I would like to ask you is that in 1976, you did the first sex therapy doctoral dissertation in Columbia's history. So what inspired you to get involved in sex therapy research in those days? You were the first there.
Well, it's interesting because the Vietnam War was going on here in the United States. There was a draft. And I was fortunate enough that I had received a National Institute of Mental Health fellowship to go to Columbia. And I remember in the first course I was taking as a graduate student in quote unquote behavior therapy at that time, we had to do a book report. And Masters and Johnson had just come out with Human Sexual Inadequacy. So I was only 22 myself. So it's a different time. People were less independent and mature perhaps than people today with all that's available on the internet, et cetera. So I raised my hand and asked permission, can I do my book report on human sexual inadequacy? Mm-hmm. And, the professors said, Perelman, you're an NIH fellow. We're paying you to do whatever you want to do. That's the whole point of it, whatever your interests are. So I came home and then told my girlfriend, now my wife, you can't believe this. They're paying me to become a sex expert. This is hysterical. I love this. So I just, I read that book and wrote a paper, and I wrote a few other papers and got a little more interested in it. And David Rubin had just written a book called Any Woman Can. So I wrote a term paper called For Those Who Haven't, because I thought he was ridiculously naive in his presentation. So I was thinking maybe I'll do something on female sexual response. And, as a young guy, I thought this is cool. I'm going to learn all about, women and sexual response. This is great. I'll have some use for this, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. And, but Cher Hite, who wrote the Hite Report, was also getting funding from the National Organization of Women. And she was at Columbia in a master's program in sociology. And this was in the middle of, sort of feminist era, if you will, where it was clear to me as a 22-year-old man, I don't want to be telling everybody I'm such a sex expert for women. So I decided I better pick something that is more of a young man's disorder than a woman's issue. When got Cher Hite, who I later appeared on television with, sort of debating a few things. We actually had a good time together. But at any rate, I decided I'd study premature ejaculation. And Helen Kaplan had just done a group treatment, the first group therapy study on treating premature ejaculation. And at that time, group treatments were very big because we had people coming back from the war, and the Veterans Administration was trying to figure out how can you treat more and more people. And at that point, there were so few sex therapists, the notion that if you could develop a group approach to treat a sexual disorder, that would be more efficient and you could reach more people. So I've been thinking, okay, I'm going to do a group. So I asked Helen if she would be on my dissertation committee. And unbeknownst to me at the time, her PhD was from Columbia. And she was a good student, but not a great student as a graduate student. So the idea that a graduate student, this young guy, was coming to her asking her to be the outside reader for his committee. It was very flattering to her, which she told me later, but I didn't realize it at the time. I just like called her and said, hi, can I come by? And I went to her office, and she was like in jeans with all these diplomas behind her. I was so impressed. So she was going to be on my committee. And I just finished doing an internship at Duke at the time. I was a chief intern there. And I started working at a private institute, Behavior Therapy Institute in New York. And Ray Rosen was one of the people working there. So I asked Ray if he would also be on my committee as an outside reader. So I had Helen Kaplan and Ray Rosen as my outside readers at that point in time. And what I also thought, having just read this Masterson Johnson book, was that the notion that you always have to treat the couple, that you can't treat anyone alone, I thought that was sort of ridiculous, quite frankly. So I structured the dissertation to have two different groups of people. One that was a male-only group, and those guys went home and gave their partners the homework assignment. And another that was a couples group where the couples met together. And both turned out to be successful. And that's where I started thinking about this idea of like, is attendance always required, or is it cooperation that's required? So that's how all this got started.
So, Michael, you were mentioning working with Helen Kaplan as a student and as a collaborator. And as we have not been lucky to have met her, could you share with us a few words about her? How would you describe her as a person, as a professional? This will be valuable for us.
Yeah, I mean, Helen was brilliant. She was an exceedingly talented woman, a very ambitious woman. All the books that she wrote, in part, she was married to a very wealthy man, second marriage, and she was able to take the summers off. And she would, back in those days, we didn't have internet or anything like this, of course, but we had an icebox, a giant refrigerator icebox that we used as a recording studio. And Helen would record a therapy session, and the rest of us would live stream that, if you will, to be able to watch her. First, we used a one-way mirror room where we were on the other side of the mirror. We'd watch the session. This was our case conference back in those days. And she would do this case, and we would discuss it, and she would take notes as we all discussed it. And that became the basis for the book that she would write the following summer. And what was particularly brilliant about Helen was her capacity to distill complicated ideas into something very simple and specific. And what she taught me was how to like go in and out from in-depth and more superficial and then back again. How to time those interventions where you're moving in and then stepping back, how deep to go, what pitfalls to avoid. And she was really superb at all these things. She was a trained psychoanalyst. And if I had one fault of her as a theoretician and as a practitioner, is that, in my opinion, she didn't really appreciate what a good cognitive behavioral therapist she was. That she was providing direct feedback to patients in ways that was very, very helpful. And yet she had a theoretical capacity to understand resistance, if you will, through her psychoanalytic approach. And that's also where she got stuck, because she saw that as the only way of conceptualizing these things. So she used to conduct our seminar almost like an orchestra, Michael's going to tell us this, and Mechi's going to tell us that, and Arlene will tell us this. And she would get us speaking from different backgrounds that we had at that point in time, and none of us obviously were as experienced as she was. I mean, I was the youngest at the time. It's incredible to think that I've been retired from Cornell for 5 years already as an emeritus professor, and I continue to teach in this sex therapy conference that we've continued. But at that point, we were meeting, twice a week there. It was very exciting. It was all very new. And she was absolutely brilliant. she could also be difficult. I was lucky as a young man that she didn't find me competitively threatening, whereas some of the women who were psychiatrists as well themselves, who were closer to her own age, she could be a big tough on. So that was a big help. The other thing that was a huge help, Helen had immigrated from Nazi Germany right after, really during World War II and right after. She was in Paris, that's where she had studied art, and then she came here. But she was a little self-conscious about her accent, and she had just published the new sex therapy. So everybody wanted to hear what she had to say. This is the first time really where sex therapy has been integrated within psychiatry. Masters was an obstetrician. Virginia Johnson was essentially a science writer and assistant to Masters, who then, developed her own career with him, of course. But here's the first time this is being done within a medical school. So we were getting requests for her to go speak all over the world. And I was only, 28 years old at that point. I was like 4 years out of graduate school. I'd gone through pretty quickly. So she asked me if I wanted to go give these lectures. So, you were talking about the honorarium for this being modest. I remember flying back from my grandfather's funeral in Chicago to go give a lecture in Newark, New Jersey for like $150. And I took it very seriously. First of all, I guess I'm an overly serious guy to begin with and compulsive about how I present. And, but I got to go all over the world speaking, and that helped both my comfort as well as helping me develop a very large international network and a national network of colleagues who I've maintained relationships with for 45 years now. So that was, so Helen, and Helen, of course, as I indicated in the lecture, she had scribbled out on a napkin this little inciters, exciters, inhibitors sort of concept of a dual model. We were having a drink together. And obviously that became something that more and more fascinated me. And I used to talk about this stuff, and I had this idea. I don't know if you know Ridwan Chopsik, but Ridwan was running an education program right when Pfizer first launched Viagra at Columbia University. He was calling it like sexual dysfunction, in 1999, sexual dysfunction 2000. And he asked me to do a lecture on female sexual disorders at that time. Most of the urologists weren't very familiar with them. So he had asked if I would do that. So I did. And I had this idea about a sexual tipping point as just, sort of in the air. Malcolm Gladwell had talked about the tipping point, and he was talking about macro movements, like in advertising and things like that. And I thought yeah, but a sexual tipping point could take both the micro and the macro and integrate it together. And I like that because I fancied myself being kind of clever too. Helen had synthesized things. She's got her biphasic model and her triphasic model. I want to come up with something. And my wife had been in the cosmetic business and the beauty industry for decades. And she said, well, I said, if I do this, other people are going to start using it. And I really want to define it and develop it. And she goes, well, why don't you copyright it? So I said, I don't know how to do that. Nobody copyrights in our business. I mean, it's ridiculous. And she goes, well, I'll give you the name of the lawyer that we use when we copyright these, lipstick titles and all these, various cosmetics, and speak to him. So I speak to him and he goes, well, you can't copyright an idea. You have to copyright something, that's concrete. He goes, why don't you come up with hats that say sexual tipping point or t-shirts, and you can throw them out to the crowd. And I said, it's a little different than that in academia. We don't really do that. But he goes, well, I can't help you then. You have to have something specific. So I said, well, what if I put sexual tipping point on a pencil? And could we copyright that? And he goes, yeah. And he goes, and in fact, do you ever make videotapes and audio tapes? And I say, all the time. He goes, well, we can copyright that material too, and copyright, let's make it for all digital material. So then many years later, when I started the foundation, after a while, I donated the copyright to the foundation. And that's how all this got started.
Yeah.
Wow. So Michael, since you worked so much together with Helen, and the first thing I ever heard about Helen Kaplan was that she was the one that added the desire phase. So that was like the introduction that I had, right? So how did she and you at the time, how was desire perceived at that time?
Desire wasn't really perceived as a separate entity in that way. Masters and Johnson had talked about desire, but they didn't really discuss it. And desire wasn't something that they treated explicitly in the 2-week program that they had. I've actually had extensive discussions with Bob Kolodny about that, who was their associate director for many, many years. He's a dear friend of mine. And what happened is people would go to Masters and Johnson in St. Louis and they'd be treated. And it was a daily program where they were like living in a hotel room, for instance, and they'd come in for a session and then they go back to the hotel room and do the Sensate focus assignment or whatever it was. And, many of these people were assisted, and then they would come back to their home environments and things would begin to fall apart for some of them. And we started taking a look at, and it's unkind because none of us would be here if Bill and Ginny hadn't published their work and got the whole sex therapy thing started. But we started looking at some of the failures of people who had been out to St. Louis, come back to New York, and what seemed to be going wrong here. And what became very, very evident to us was this notion of desire and what constituted desire. That somebody may have the capacity for sex, but if they're very angry at each other for some other reason, even if they're young and they're able to have sex, despite my tipping point model about how the mind can interfere, if the body is that willing, you can go ahead and function anyway, and yet they didn't want to. And then that would create other tensions, another vicious cycle, and all of a sudden they'd be in our office asking for assistance. And we saw this pattern emerging. So that's when Helen wrote that next summer. She wrote a book on desire. And in fairness, I also want to mention Harold Leaf simultaneously in Philadelphia was doing work in the same way. So he had an article about desire. Helen had an article about desire. She had just started what's it called? The Journal of Sex and Marital Therapy. She was its first editor, along with Cliff Sager, a man she had actually a relationship with and wrote books with before she married Charles Lazarus, who was her second husband. And so she had this book on desire. As I said, she used to write her books during the summer. And that's when we started thinking about a triphasic model as opposed to her biphasic model of arousal and orgasm. Now she's talking about desire, arousal, and orgasm. And obviously this has become a very complicated subject within sexual medicine. So DSM-3 talked about desire. Helen was on that committee. And then subsequent committees and work began to take a look more at evidence and empirical medicine, evidence-based medicine, so that the notion of expert opinion was no longer is valued. And that became complicated. And yet with the sexual medicine drugs that are approaching desire for women, there's been a reemergence and appreciation of Helen's perspective on desire. And as you know, this has become a convoluted and complex discussion about the obvious tremendous overlap between desire and arousal, and to what extent are these really separate and distinct, or as opposed to highly overlapping and related measures. So that's how that happened. It was off of those failures that we identified another area to be looked at. I would say the same for me is going on now when I take a look at resolution, because the notion of satiety, and especially male refractory period, where you're limited in your ability, and it's a rude awakening to so many men, and they have a very negative reaction to that. And you have all these baby boomers out there now, which is why I was in my presentation suggesting that sex therapists may want to look at delayed ejaculation, because it's really one of the only areas that there's no pharmaceutical cure at this point in time. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity for therapists.
Yeah, you're right. I appreciate that in your in your lecture. You are one of the most experienced sexologists, and we would like to know, Michael, which specific clinical skill would you say have contributed the most to your clinical practice?
It's a very good question. I would say the ability to engage with people. You mentioned my passion when we were talking before. I actually like people a lot, and I really enjoy the opportunity to assist them. And I think for me, what I needed to learn was to be a better listener and to speak less. I can be verbose and I can be active, which turned out to be valuable. When I was a graduate student at Columbia, I didn't like the psychoanalytic model of being so passive and just listening. And, you know, every once in a while you provide this profound interpretation. And there's all this, you know, sort of mystery and magic that seems to be associated. I didn't care for that. It just seemed to me that some things needed to be approached more practically. And yet I found some of, I had been an undergraduate at Wisconsin, and there was a very strong behavioral psychology program there, you know, stemming from really a Skinnerian tradition. And some brilliant people like Peter Lang on psychophysiological disorders who really captured my interest on that. But learning to listen and also learning to be more humble. We really have to approach this with a great deal of humility. Despite our ability to help facilitate people's goals, there's a limited impact you're going to have meeting with somebody once a week, even if it's twice a week. So be modest, be humble, be a really good listener, but don't be afraid to trust your instincts. Proceed with caution.
But I think
love what you do.
Yeah, I think, Michael, I don't know if you agree with me that there was a you know, decades in which, you know, the cognitive behavioral approach in some way was and is still prominent. But and so in some way many perceived the sexologist like you know, people with a box of tools, just applying the tools, and that's it. To the sex therapy being, you know, a series of exercises.
Cookie cutter exercises, yes.
Yeah, maybe now we are a little bit going back to listening to the patient. Or
no, I think it's very important. I commented before about Helen's psychoanalytic training, and I know my own dynamic training was very, very important. If we start thinking about some of the things, I'll frequently discuss the difference between process and content, both with patients and with people that I'm supervising, and understanding how one is communicating, how it's being received, what people are resistant to or able to incorporate, that you can't just beat them on the head with your knowledge and think it's going to make a difference. And in fact, if you do that in an inappropriate way, you'll either lose the patient or create other problems for them and for yourself. So psychoanalysis, I think, had a lot to offer as an understanding of the interpersonal relationship between the therapist and the patient, the context of the therapy itself. And I think we're also, so many of us are relearning that again, using Zoom, having telemedicine, so that we're not necessarily in the same room with the patient. So, you know, all of us can see each other's faces much more clearly. So we, you know, the constant refrain about like, oh, you lose all the, you know, subtle body gestures. Well, actually, the facial gestures you can see more closely. Normally I'm sitting 5 to 6 feet away from somebody, whereas right now I'm 1 foot away from this computer screen, as I suspect you are as well. So you can see these subtle facial movements, and yet you are missing so much of the body. And there's no question that you're losing something, but you're gaining some other things, and not the least of which is the convenience and the ease for which people can be able to access you if they have access to this technology, which of course not everyone has, but it's progressively getting spread, you know, broader and broader amongst our population. So more people are able to be helped.
Michael, which sexual dysfunction, in your opinion, is mostly mistreated by sexologists, is treated in a wrong way in a say?
I would certainly say that desire is complex, but I think there's so much conversation about that. I've become an advocate, obviously, in the last decade for encouraging us to take a look at delayed ejaculation and recognizing that difficulty with orgasm is not just a problem of women. You know, when I first started, Lonnie Barback was doing this. That was the other reason I went to premature ejaculation. Lonnie was doing pre-orgasmic women's groups in California at the same time that I was doing this work in New York, and she was teaching women how to have their first orgasm through masturbation. And that became normative for so many women. And with Sex and the City, for instance, that just became, you know, just a more conventional conversation to have. I was actually the psychologist who was used promotionally by Sex and the City because they would have a rebroadcast of the program on Wednesdays. And it usually would come out on Sunday, but on Wednesday they rebroadcast and they wanted to have more viewers. So at that time, AOL had those chat rooms. So they established a chat room where people could write in with questions relevant to what the girls in the program were having as issues. And then the analyst was in, and I would answer those questions. So that was fun. And my wife enjoyed it as well because they would send me the videotapes of the program 1 week in advance so we could have viewing parties for our friends in advance of the regular release. So that was fun. But delayed ejaculation for men, I think, is a very important topic, in part because of the impact on their partners as well, as these guys, when they're not functioning, start avoiding sex and avoiding all affection. Now, the notion that sexual dysfunction leads to avoidance of all kinds of intimacy that has nothing to do with sex has been a long-standing understanding really amongst sexologists. But the fact that delayed ejaculation is something that can be, I think, very easily treated, which is really a paradigm shift from how it was perceived previously. So that's something that I've just sort of enjoyed trying to educate people about. And, you know, just simple things like men fake orgasms as well, not just women. And that seemed inconceivable to people to grasp 10 years ago. And I think people understand, again, what I said in the lecture about the overlap between male and female sexuality and how profound that is when you look at the area under the curve. I don't know if that concept was fully understandable to everybody, but essentially what you're saying is that the amount of overlap between individuals is so much greater than the differentiation between the two groups, that on an individual basis, men and women are just tremendously alike despite the obvious differences. So I guess delayed ejaculation would be my answer.
But that's what I was expecting that you would answer also. And actually, I mean, I have made many lectures in my life, but I must say that I have 2 slides that are your words and I use them very much, and they are on delayed ejaculation. And it's the part where, I don't know where I got it, it's yours and I have your name there, but it's a part where it says that, you know, theories like the man is afraid of intimacy, the man is afraid of coming closer and all this, we don't have evidence for this, but actually it's quite, the common issues are 1, 2, 3, you know, the idiosyncratic masturbatory style and so on. And I think that this is really what we have achieved, what, you know, you and others in the field, I mean, in your generation have achieved, to actually bring in a more common sense approach, an approach that takes into account, I guess, that tries to answer questions like what explains this, and maybe this can also sometimes be found in research, you know, in answers, we can find them in research. So we're going a little bit away of theories that don't have a mechanism, or at least assume a mechanism that we can understand. Of course, it's not always that way.
That's, I think, you know, going back to Helen, one of the most important things I took away from her was the ability to try and take very complex concepts and reduce them to simpler explanations, while still allowing for a deeper understanding should you want to go there. And I think that ability to go back and forth to me has been one of the things I'm proudest of in terms of my own development as an intellectual, if you will, to try and be able to do that. And it's why I'm hoping to be able to raise the money to do the animation on the tipping point so that I can really more fully explore that. I was speaking with Bud Burnett, for instance, a very well-known urologist, brilliant researcher in the United States at Hopkins, about some of the work that he's done at a cellular level, and to be able to show that how that also has like a turn on and turn off, and have that little dimmer switch explode into demonstrating that and explaining that, and then move back into just like, hey, you're hot or not, you're turned on or you're not turned on. So we have something that's very, very simple, and yet it can be drilled down to an extraordinary level of complexity, literally on a subatomic level. And to me, that's like just fascinating.
Yeah. And Michael, talking about men,
yes,
we often see men, for example, seeking help for a psychogenic sexual dysfunction that are unfamiliar with psychotherapy or relative processes. So which clinical approach is the best way to avoid their dropout? For example, I learned to be very, explicit, practical, synthetic, and to explain them the process, why they got the symptom and what we can do, at least in the first phase of, of the counseling. And then when I get their attention, I can slow down a little bit with explanations and explore more in deep their psychological issue. But what is your approach?
See, but I think what you just articulated is perfect. You're meeting people where they are, and then you're gradually shifting them to be able to explore and understand something in a non-threatening way that may not be their initial view of what's going on, but you're helping them explain it. And part of what I wanted to do in starting the Psychology Today blogs that I've written on these topics was to offer something that therapists might be able to share with their own patients, or explanations that they might be able to share with their own patients, to help them with some of these more difficult reactions that you can get from patients when you start explaining to them something about like, oh yeah, this is, for instance, the case that I mentioned, I think a lot of people would be surprised that I was willing to essentially seem to ignore, I wasn't really, it was in the back of my mind the whole time, the fact that this guy's mother had committed suicide, the fact that her father had sexually abused her, because these are all such powerful, powerful events in someone's life that how can you ignore that? Well, it has to do with what does the patient want from you? It is not for us, in my opinion, to determine what their goals should be. Now, if something violates your own standards, I would say know yourself and know that's when you may need to refer to someone else, as opposed to trying to bang somebody over the head to adopt your perspective. And I think too many therapists have a tendency to try and convince somebody of a more liberal and thoughtful, psychologically oriented point of view that some of us might share, as opposed to understanding what it is they're looking for and what we need to do to be able to assist them. So I applaud your meeting these men where you find them, and then helping to cultivate whatever additional information or perspective they need in order to be able to obtain the goal that they've asked you to help them obtain.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Michael, I heard you before mention about asking patients, what do you think explains your problem? And I was very happy to hear that, because actually this was like something that initiated my PhD, which was on sexual dysfunctions, was, the data that we have that on the general population, this is not data on sex, but that subjective perceived health predicts morbidity and mortality better than a medical diagnosis, doctor's diagnosis. So that means that, people know, I mean, we all know a lot about ourselves, that maybe we cannot put it down, in forms of medical diagnosis. And this information we know is predictive of what happens to us. So I guess that trusting our patients to and listening to them is, I guess, where we can get a lot of information from.
For sure. And this relates to what Francesca was saying as well, because really you're talking about how do you engage the patient so that they feel actively appreciated within the therapeutic process, willing to allow us to have access to their own inner world and inner experiences, to trust us with this information, this private information about them. How do you engage them sufficiently, create enough rapport with them, and you have to respect them. It couldn't be any more simple in that sense. And you can't. And I think there's interview techniques that help facilitate rapport. Mm-hmm. But at some level, you have to really feel it in your own heart that you want to help them. And if there's somebody you don't want to help, those are the people who really you should be referring and not, quote unquote, holding on to.
Yeah. So Michael, coming back to the sexual tipping point model, yes. We all use it. It's influenced, I think, the clinical practice of a lot of sexologists. So what, in a few words, in what way has it actually contributed to our clinical practice according to through your eyes?
I think it has to do with what I was saying before. It's a mechanism for going from big to small, from micro to macro and back again, because I think all these things need to be understood. And it also then provides an opportunity to take a look at what are the critical variables, and of all the billions of possible things out there, where does one begin? How does one start? So for me, identifying what are the maintaining variables, factors, if you will, and having a sense of what's contributing, what's not, what's overbalanced, how do you recalibrate that? It gives a simple idea that you can explain to your patients, but also has sufficient robust vigor as a theory to be able to basically incorporate all the new things that have yet to be discovered, let alone the ones that we already know. And I think that is hopefully its potential for the future as a model. I think it actually applies to a lot more than sex, but I wasn't so arrogant as to say how this can be a way of having some universal understanding of the world, which I think is what all of us struggle to obtain. Anyway,
so Michael, usually, much fame come along with a lot of critics also. What are the most common misinterpretation of the STP model?
I would say people just see it as another dual control model. And, obviously, John Bancroft and colleagues have a tremendously successful research oeuvre of data and material and theoretical thought and practical experimentation that is led to the development of questionnaires and superb research coming out of Kinsey and elsewhere. And so what's this tipping point thing? Is this just some another way of saying the same thing? And it's not. I actually think we've moved more towards each other because I know they fully appreciate also that things are variable, things can be continuous, things aren't just categorical, but that's not how that was originally presented. It was originally presented as a sort of dual model. And what's particularly important to me is to recognize the spectrum, the continuity, and how that applies to every one of these factors. And that's why I want to do this three-dimensionally, that all these things, meet in such different and unique ways, which then can explain the uniqueness of every individual who we encounter in our therapy. And for me, I wasn't as much concerned with a research model as a clinical model. So this is really something that's come out of my clinical work as opposed to something that's come out of a theoretical perspective that then led to some research, which I think is what Bancroft and his colleagues have done so successfully, Janssen, et cetera.
Yeah, but also, Michael, I think that as I perceive, the dual control model is a way to talk about propensity, something more constitutional, right? So it's based on the evolutionary theory, in which, you know, we are here to reproduce ourselves, so we can explain why someone is more inhibited or excited and so on. While I think your model is much more, let's say, complex in the sense that explain the fact that a person beyond his propensity can behave or can perceive sexuality in different ways, in different moments of his life, in different phases of his life. So it's much more appropriate to explain the variability, I think.
Yes. Well, I think it becomes, again, it comes out of clinical experience.
Yeah.
And that's the reality of human beings, is that this infinite variety of ways of being, and yet we're all so similar, yet we're all so different. And how does one have something that's simple and understandable, and yet something that can incorporate all that complexity? I go back to premature ejaculation. Part of the other reason I studied that is it seemed like a simpler disorder to try and characterize. Although what's interesting to me, having served on a number of the ISSM committees where we're trying to negotiate the definition, you know, you start arguing about, you know, like how many seconds constitutes this or that. And I think part of it is some of us, you know, we see different people, so we have a different perspective based on the clients that we've seen. And that then we come in knowing that and feeling it very strongly, and yet we may be looking at very different populations at times. But to your point, premature ejaculation, for instance, could be highly predetermined by a number of biological organic factors. So but that doesn't mean that everybody who had all those factors in place genetically turned out to be a premature ejaculator because of different life experience. And how that translates into a particular individual is exceedingly complex. And yet we can say some people are more predisposed than others. And then what do we do about that? I would say, you know, those are the ones who you actually need to use some medication to slow down the process so they can learn to identify what they're feeling, because it doesn't happen so quickly. So I think that's particularly important. And I think the sexual tipping point model can capture both that simplicity and complexity. And that's what's so important about it to me.
And it's also that all these factors, they don't just add up, but they actually have a dynamic relationship one with the other.
Yes.
Right. So one can enhance the other, or so. And this is what
the opposite. And that's what's so, I think, you know, so interesting. I have that slide where it talks about the bidirectionality. So, you know, you imagine a caress from your lover and it's being so wonderful. But if you're on the subway in New York and some creep like caresses you like that, it's awful.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, that's,
mm-hmm.
And yet the physical friction is exactly the same, but the context is so different that the reaction is different.
Mm-hmm.
And yet somebody may be predisposed to find that more erotic, more sensitive, better, and other people just, it feels like nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So how does context then begin to impact? How does choice of the person doing that to you and your feelings about them begin to impact? How does that interact with culture? All these things are relative. And yet if you start talking about all of it at the same time, it just seems like there's so much.
Overwhelming.
You know nothing, it's overwhelming. And yet if you get too simple, which at times I've been accused of, like, oh, you're hot, you're not. That's so, you know, it's so sophomoric and superficial. No, it's how does all this combine in these complex ways to result in that moment that's orgasmic, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So, Michael, you have been dedicated to educating the next generation of healthcare students and professionals about the importance of embracing a biomedical, psychosocial, behavioral, and cultural approach to understanding sexual disorder. Can you share with us the concept behind the MAP Education and Research Foundation?
Yes, I guess in 2012, I had the opportunity to just very fortunately, an attorney was willing to help me establish a not-for-profit charity that we've been able to focus on a mission of both educating future professionals, continuing education for current professionals, and ways of rewarding people who are advocating the kind of transdisciplinary approach to sexual issues that I believe. And I've been fortunate that some of my friends and former patients have been willing to donate money to a foundation to help me begin to establish a legacy for that kind of approach, and a structure that hopefully will continue beyond my own lifetime to be able to advocate for a more complex understanding that's also accessible on a more simplistic level to everyone, so that more and more people are able to get assistance. And yet it will also be able to incorporate the sexual tipping point model, because I believe it can incorporate all the new discoveries that we'll have and the new experiences and capabilities clinicians will develop. So we've got both what's going on in medicine and pharma, along with what's developing and sort of greater existential understanding of the human condition and how that combines together to facilitate improvements in just the quality of our life in general. But I've limited my focus at the current time to just our sex lives and the importance of that in improving quality of life. So that was in 2012. I established it. The website itself now has had hundreds of thousands of views. Everything I've ever written or presented is available for free download at this point on it. And we also give a $1,000 prize plus a certificate to often young people, sometimes more mature clinicians, for best presentation at some of the professional sexological meetings.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I am aware of this award because I am following it whenever it occurs. So another question, and we would close with this question, is if there are a few tips that you would share with this other sexologists and with colleagues, tips that would help us not make too many mistakes in our clinical practice, what would those be?
I think, Steve Levine has spoken eloquently about the importance of avoiding hubris in your attempts to assist people. That, again, we have to be more modest in our expectations. I think committed to that assistance with full passion, but understanding of our own limitations. And I think what's important is for people who want to help people to be able to do so. And there's so many different ways one can do that. And for me, being able to combine both an academic and clinical career and now the foundation has led to a very meaningful and rewarding life. And I would encourage others to just find their own place. I don't want to use the cliche, find your passion, because I think that's overdone. But I do think identifying something where you would do it even if it wasn't work because you like to do it, I think it's so important. And you're likely to find success with that if you're doing what you want to be doing and doing it with concentration, effort, integrity, and focus. It makes a difference, and it leads to a good life.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Michael, I want to confess something before we really finish. You have said so many interesting things, and I'm all ears, of course, but there's one thing that you said at the beginning, and it's really stuck in my mind. You have been with your wife since 1976?
Actually, we've been together since 1971. She was a freshman.
That's even before I was born.
Yeah.
Wow.
We've lived lived together for over 50 years at this point.
Wow. Well,
She'll tell you I still have a lot to learn.
well, yeah, it's a continuum. Yeah, it never finishes, does it?
Yes, exactly.
But so, Michael, thank you very much. We'll be in touch by email. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye.